Hey everyone, my name is Erica and I'm a traditional media artist that loves working with watercolor. And in today's video, I'm going to be sharing with you how I paint a simple bird using Viviva's watercolor sheets. Alright, so let's go ahead and get started with the supplies that we're going to be using for today's tutorial. In the first part of this video, you're gonna see me actually sketch in my bird very lightly using a regular drawing pencil on my sheet of watercolor paper before getting started with my painting process. Now, this is something that you can decide if you wanna draw in for yourself, completely freehand, but you're also going to have access to my downloadable outline sketch that you can transfer onto your sheet of watercolor paper using something like tracing paper. And you can grab that via a link that Viviva is going to leave for you in the description box below this video. So if you do decide to transfer my outline sketch, then you're gonna need some tracing paper. And of course, whatever it is you decide, whether you decide to draw the bird freehand or actually transfer it, you're gonna need a pencil and a soft rubber graphite eraser. Aside from those drawing tools, you're gonna need your set of watercolors. You're gonna need at least one paintbrush, and I'm gonna be using a size 14 round brush for this entire piece. But if you're just getting started with watercolors, I would highly recommend using a smaller round brush, something like maybe a size 4 or a size 2, so you can get into the smallest areas of the bird that we're gonna be painting, especially the eye and the beak, and you can have a little bit more control. You're also going to need some sort of watercolor paper, or at least paper that is intended for water-soluble mediums. This can be a single sheet, it can be a pad, it can be a block, or it can be a sketchbook. You're gonna need some form of color mixing palette, an absorbent rag or regular kitchen paper towels, and a cup or container with clean water. Alright, so the very first thing that I did is I created my preliminary pencil sketch very lightly so that my pencil line work wouldn't show through my transparent paint. To ensure that the proportions of my bird's body as well as the overall shapes looked relatively believable, I made sure to use a reference photo loosely, but I added my own elements into the picture. Like for example, I added my very own tree branch into this picture that didn't have one originally, as well as little leaves. I really wanted to add in some green into my painting. When you're creating a pencil sketch on your watercolor paper, make sure that you're not pressing down too hard because you don't want to scratch or damage your paper in any way. Okay, so once your sketch is ready, we're gonna go ahead and get started with our first color mixtures that we're gonna be using for this bird's body. This is a blue bird, which means that we're gonna be using lots of yellows and oranges as well as blues. And the first color mixtures that we're gonna be creating are the yellows and the oranges. I decided to go with the gold ochre and the burnt umber from my color sheets. And all I do to bring out the color onto my paint mixing palette is I pre-wet the bristles of my paintbrush and I gently swivel those bristles on my color sheets, and they are very easily activated. As you can see, one of the wells on my color mixing palette has the gold ochre and the other one has the burnt umber. I make sure to go in with a light and translucent version of my gold ochre, which is the lightest color that I am using in this area. And just to make sure that it's nice and translucent, you can just add more water into your color mixture or grab a little bit of that gold ochre and place it in another well in your paint mixing palette and add water to that, just to make sure that you're going in nice and translucent, and you can start building on that color to really create more dimension and even an illusion of shadow under the wing in this area. You're going to notice that I then place the burnt umber on top of the wet paint, and this darker color, this more orangey color, starts dissipating into the previous lighter color. And I make sure to place the burnt umber under the wing and in the edge further away from us in the bird's body to make that rounded out look and to give the bird's body more dimension. I really like making sure that I am creating different values, adding in a variation in color even, throughout my painting so that nothing is flat. Always be thinking about how you can create a variation in values and transparencies when you're working with watercolor so that your painting can have a nice, more of a three-dimensional look and feel and glowiness to it instead of going in very dark and saturated all throughout. Once I finish with that, I decide to jump on over to painting the little tree branch. And for this, I create a color mixture of burnt umber plus slate black to darken it. Right there, you can see how I am very carefully working around the little bird's feet. And hopefully by this point, you can also see how all throughout the areas that I am painting, I am actually leaving little tiny areas of whiteness of the paper shine through completely. And these tiny little sections are just naturally, organically created as I am doing those brush strokes in a way that I feel best describes the texture of that particular space or element that I am painting in at the time. After having placed my initial layer of brown, I added even more slate black into my brown color mixture to darken it even further, and then I dropped in this darker brown only in certain areas where the cast shadow would make sense, so that this way I can create a nice variation and a sensation of texture even within the tree branch. With the tree branch done, it was time to move on to painting the little leaves. And the color mixture for my greens was created by mixing together Viridian Green with Gold Ochre. I decided to add the Gold Ochre into the Viridian Green so that we can make it look a little bit more natural. Once I arrived at a green that I liked, I grabbed a little bit of that color mixture and brought it onto the next well on my paint mixing palette and added a little bit of slate black to darken that second color mixture. This way we can go in with a lighter green and add a little bit of a darker green into only certain areas while that first layer of paint is still wet. You can play around with your color ratios in your green color mixtures as much as you'd like. I would recommend testing these out on a scrap piece of watercolor paper before actually going into your painting with them. But as long as you have a lighter green and a darker green, it's gonna be fine. Make sure that you're dropping in the paint gently and lightly, and that your second darker color doesn't overtake the lighter green that you've laid down previously, because watercolor is going to expand into the wetness of the paper. The whole idea behind creating your two different greens is to have that variety of different green values within the leaves. And sometimes when we're painting in small areas like these leaves, when using watercolor, it can be very easy to lose control of our water. So make sure that you're not going in with a large amount of water and paint on paper that is already wet. I would recommend constantly just removing the excess water and paint from your paintbrush bristles by making sure that you're using your absorbent towel to blot any excess water that may be dripping off of them, or gently scraping the bristles constantly alongside the top of your jar of water or alongside the walls of your paint mixing palette wells. Once we finish with this layer of paint in the leaves, we're gonna get started with the blue sections of the bird. And for this, I created a mixture of peacock blue, Persian blue, and a bit of slate black. So once again, I started with a light and translucent version of this color. And once this initial lighter color has been placed, we're gonna be dropping in a more saturated, darker version of this blue, only into certain areas. Notice how I am moving my paintbrush around very loosely, very lightly. In most cases, I am just very gently touching the tips of my bristles onto my paper and allowing that paint to drip down. And at the same time, I'm also leaving very tiny little areas of the whiteness of the paper shining through the paint that are gonna be left completely untouched. Once that first layer of translucent blue had been placed, I added even more Prussian blue and a tiny bit of slate black into my blue color mixture, and this is what you're seeing me drop in right now. I am taking clues from my reference photo as to where to drop in this darker blue. I am making sure to notice the darker values in the bird's head, and that's where I'm dropping in this second blue. So it's mostly a little bit under the beak, somewhere around the eye, and also along the edge of the bird's head so that I can give it a little bit of a rounded out effect. After I was done with that layer in the bird's head, it was time to move on to starting that first layer of paint in the wing. Once again, I get started with my lightest and most translucent version of my blue. And only after that's been placed, I go ahead and start placing a more saturated and darker version of the blue, only in some areas. I am creating that illusion of those feathers being separate by just leaving a tiny white outline of paper that I didn't touch with my bristles at all. So that paper is dry, and because the paper is dry, the paint didn't expand into it. All right, so it's time to allow that wing to dry, and we're now gonna get started with the bird's beak. And this we're gonna be painting with slate black. But as you can see, even in this area, I am going in first and foremost with a very light and translucent version of my slate black. Hopefully you can tell how I am leaving certain little sections of my paper completely untouched by paint so that those can be highlights in both my eye and my beak. It's very important to leave highlights in animals' eyes. Just like when we're painting a portrait of a human, we need to make sure that there are highlights in the eye because those highlights really give that more realistic look to the eye and makes the animal come to life. So once again, I am getting clues from my reference photo as to the different values, the lights, the midtones, and the darkest darks in both of these areas. And I am making sure to work incrementally in layers from lights to darks and making sure that I am creating a variety of different values even in these tiny areas. Now, once again, these areas are very, very small. So make sure that you're allowing the layers to dry in between your applications and make sure that you're not losing control of the amount of water that you're placing on your paper because it's very easy for that second or that third layer of paint to completely overtake the lighter grays that you've already placed. All right, so with the eye and the beak done, it's now time to move on to the bird's feet. Now, when I am painting birds, I like reminding myself not to add way too much detail into the bird's feet or claws because the more detail you start adding into a certain area of your painting, the more you're going to call the viewer's attention into that area because areas with more detail and more texture have a heavier visual weight than areas with lower detail and lower texture. To paint in the bird's feet, I created a grayish brown color by mixing together my burnt umber with a tiny bit of slate black. Now, as you can see, I first went in with a very translucent version of this grayish brown color, and then I added more slate black and burnt umber into the mixture to go in with a second layer of paint only to darken certain areas. I made sure to allow each layer of brown to dry in between so that the darker, more saturated brown didn't completely overtake the lighter one. As you can see, I am barely touching the tip of my paintbrush and I end up with tiny areas of highlight, midtones, and darker darks. So after having painted the bird's feet, it's now time to look over our painting and notice whether we have to further darken certain areas or sharpen details, things like that. Usually watercolor tends to dry a bit lighter than how it looks when it's wet, so I like coming back to analyze if I need to darken things even further. The painting is completely dry by this point, and as you can see, I am jumping around from area to area using the paint color for that particular area in a very saturated state to push the darkest darks in some little parts here and there. If I go in with a very saturated color and I feel that I accidentally laid down a very blocky, heavy shape, what I do is I remove the color from my paintbrush bristles and I go in with a clean and slightly dampened paintbrush and run my bristles along the edge of that shape, and that is going to make the paint bleed out and create that softer edge to it. I am always thinking of keeping everything irregular. I keep my darkest shapes here very abstract, very organic, and I am staying away from any sort of stark looking mark or outline or anything like that because that is going to take away from the realism of the piece. I also make sure to be very light-handed with darker and more saturated color mixtures. All right, so right there, I'm just finishing up with creating that illusion for that middle vein in the leaves. Usually less is more, and there is no need to go overboard. And finally, I decide to finish this painting by adding a bit of splattering around the bird. Splattering is super fun and it's quite easy to do. All you have to do is make sure that you're going in with a saturated paint color that has quite a bit of water in it. You then load up your paintbrush bristles with that color, and very gently you can use a pencil or another paintbrush, anything like that, to do gentle tapping motions, and that paint is going to splatter onto your paper. If you don't want to get any splattering on your bird, you can do what I did right there and use your scrap pieces of watercolor paper to cover it up as you're doing your splattering. Alright everyone, that is it for today's bird painting tutorial. I really hope that you enjoyed it and that you found it helpful. And if you like this video, please like and subscribe and tell us in the comments what you'd like to watch next. Thank you so very much for popping by today and have a beautiful rest of the day. Bye guys!